This is a conversation about the nature of opportunities in the region. I'm just going to give a little bit of context to Tomo's comments. You heard me earlier talk about how we've lost the fight against climate change. Bear that in mind. 1.5 degrees, unfortunately, has to remain as a target because we have to get emissions back down to that to have a sustainable planet, but it will go above 1.5, and it'll probably go to 2 to 2.4 or something like that until we can stabilise the atmosphere. Stabilise is going to be tough. It's going to involve a lot of forest regrowth, a lot of carbon capture and sequestration, a lot of changes of agriculture. So there's work to be done to stabilise the climate. It means that climate is going to get ugly. We are going to have, for example, typhoons of twice the strength in the Philippines going forward. If we don't meet our 2030 and our 2050 climate or emission reduction targets, those typhoons will be triple the strength. That's the difference. So we still have to meet our 2030 emissions targets, which we've committed to globally, and meet our 1.5 degrees Celsius targets, which were recommitted here in this building at the G20 meeting last November. That's what we're stuck with, unfortunately. One thing, however, that has become certain, partly because of this greater understanding of the challenges we face amongst global investors, and partly because of the number of governments around the world that have now committed to 2030 targets, like the Japanese government, for example, that's made a strong commitment that's following on 2030 cuts of 46% emissions. I mean, some governments, the Danish government's committed to 70% cut in emissions and so on. One thing is certain, the future is going to be green. Every investor we speak to now says the debate is not where we're going, the debate is how quickly we're going to get there and who will be the winners and who will be the losers. And therein lies the opportunity for ASEAN. There is a tsunami of change coming through. We will see drastic changes in energy pricing. We'll talk about that in a minute, whether it works in Indonesia, etc. We will see more governments bringing sledgehammer-style incentives like the IRA in the US, which has led to an overnight growth of green hydrogen and various other investments because of the vast level of subsidies involved. We will see more carbon border adjustment mechanism project like the European Union is bringing in, where if you are not capturing carbon taxes or carbon prices domestically, the European Union will capture them for you as you try and export into that market. That's a powerful incentive for every country in the world that exports to Europe to introduce their own carbon pricing. Otherwise, the tax revenue will be collected by Europe. And Europe is perfectly honest in saying their main job is to encourage emission trading schemes and carbon taxes of a similar level, $100 a tonne, folks, at the moment, to Europe, not the $2 a tonne we see in Indonesia right now. And Indonesia's scheme will not be recognised by Europe until it matches European pricing. That's an opportunity for Indonesia's treasury to collect more taxes because of export considerations. Of course, the opportunities are not just in energy. They're in industry. That's a big part of the export stuff. They're in mining, commodities booms for nickel, for rare earths, etc. They're in urban development, where some of the biggest gains we can make around emissions will be making sure our built environment is fit for the future, not fit for the past. You know, in the 10 years before 2020, we installed more air conditioning capacity globally than we installed renewable energy capacity. This was a disaster. The reason is we installed really crappy air conditioning capacity, very inefficient, little boxes stuck on the side of buildings, instead of thinking about what Shenzhen has done in district heating, district cooling systems, which take a third the amount of energy to keep those towers in the Shenzhen financial district really cool, really cold. There are options available for us that we just have to plan for. So our urban development in line is going to be very important going forward. Of course, we also need to understand in the concept of resilience. Resilience is going to mean making our cities resilient. By 2050, 80% of people in ASEAN we expect to be living in cities. That's a huge increase from now. That's partly because of climate volatility is going to force small landholders off the land again and again, and they're going to go to cities. Cities can be growth engines, wealth engines. They usually are. If we design them right, they will create more wealth and more growth. That's a matter of designing now. So not just the new capital in Kalimantan, but what do we do with Bangkok, with Ho Chi Minh City, with Jakarta, to make sure these are magnets for growth, and that growth, that wealth, is essential for resilience. Because unless we are wealthier, we will find it harder to survive the shocks of the 21st century, which will be continual, persistent, and deep. Think pandemics repeated again and again. That's what we're preparing for now. We need to be sure about what we're doing. We need to make sure the capital is mobilized. We need to be sure we've got the capability to make this change. That's my pitch anyway. Now I want to hear Tomo's pitch. Tomo is a very interesting character. Not only has he got this job in Japan's largest bank. I'm not talking about the private stuff, Tomo, don't worry. He's also been a driver of the Net Zero Banking Alliance's work globally on transitions. And he's been engaging with regulators around the world on this topic as well. So tell us what this looks like, this whole transition agenda, from the work you've been doing, Tomo.
Thank you, Sean, for setting the scene, but you asked me to set the scene as well, so I'm going to reset the scene.
Detail, please, detail.
Okay.
And everyone wants to know where to park their money, so give them opportunities.
Okay, and I think you said to me, spend as much time as you want. So I'll do that, but if I speak too much, just say shut up, and I'll shut up. But you touched on, Sean, thank you for having me, and very glad to be here. And I would like to make some, for the purpose of discussion, make some provocative comments, because I think that makes sense, than just say something nice and, we all agree on one thing and, nothing, we learn from this discussion. So let me make some comments. But before doing that, I want to step back a little bit and discuss with you or explain to you the journey so far. So, Sean, you mentioned about Net Zero Banking Alliance. I sit on the steering group, which is like a board of Net Zero Banking Alliance. We joined the alliance almost 2 years ago, May 21. And of course, as a result, as Yuki mentioned this morning, we also became a member of GFAN. So GFAN's Net Zero Banking Alliance is part of GFAN's family, one of 7 alliances. When we joined Net Zero Banking Alliance, the discussion back then was very interesting. So 2050 net zero, we committed to that. How do we get there? The vast majority of the participants or the members of the steering group or some basically the big banks from Europe or US, they say, oh, it's not a big deal, come on, you divest. Divestment will send a signal to the clients or the issuer, and therefore that will basically encourage them to be aligned with net zero. No problem, let's do that. That was the, I would say, overwhelming narrative back then. I told them, are you sure about that? At least as a Japanese or Asian institution, we did not think that is the case. And I'll tell you why. 2 main reasons. We have existing exposures. So if you're asset managers or if you're a green bank starting from zero, maybe that's easier because you can choose and say, you can basically cherry pick. You pick a green asset and say, we're going to allocate whatever billion on this, and forget about this coal or these legacy assets. Whereas in our case, our balance sheet is $3 trillion, and we have existing exposure to what we would call high-emitting sectors. So you can't just say, forget about brown, and let's only focus on green assets or green, taxonomy compliant, let's say. So given we have exposures, we need to reduce the carbon emission for the existing loans, not only about new opportunities. So you have to think about existing exposures, but also think about the opportunities. So that's one thing that we basically had to push back. The other one is about the business model. So it depends on your business model. Some banks will look at this sustainability agenda or ESG as an opportunity only. So if you're more of a transactional bank, you can go to all the clients and say, are you interested in doing this, that? If the client says no, you just move on. Whereas in our case, as I said, because we have existing exposure, sometimes billions of dollars. You can't just go and say, oh, you're not interested, you're not ambitious enough. Okay, let's go to next clients. Because you have the existing exposure, you have to deal with the client. So the way we engage with our client is, as opposed to say, we committed to net zero and I want you to do it, rather the message we're sending is that you and we are on the same boat. Your emission is my emission because of scope 3. That means your decarbonization is my decarbonization. So let's work together. That's how we tell our clients, that's how we basically get them on board. So the last 2 years, it's been very interesting journey because we were, to some extent, explaining to other Net Zero Banking Alliance members, and some agreed with us from the beginning, but many now, I think, understand that it's not just a green investment, it's also the transition finance that will make brown sectors become greener, or at least less brown. So I'm very glad to see yesterday, today, we're all talking about transition finance, not only green or sustainable finance. So what does this all mean? So we spent 2 years or so having this discussion. I think we came to a good place now. We're all talking about transition finance. But so what are we going to do? Sean mentioned it's not where we're going. How quickly can we go? But it's not just about how quickly, but how can we scale up transition finance is something I also want to discuss. But let me, before I talk, make some provocative comments, I also want to make one more observation, which is the outcome. And Sean, you mentioned already about 1.5 degrees or net zero by 2050. We all know where we want to be by 2050. But how do you get there? We need to consider, carefully understand what's the current profile of our emission. And the number I often look at is, if you look at ASEAN or Japan, the CO2 emissions from electricity is almost 50%. 48% for ASEAN, actually the number is higher for Japan, 49%. So basically 50% of CO2 is coming from electricity. And that's why at least I believe, energy transition has to come first, but that will unlock the opportunity in other sectors. So we're talking to our electricity sector clients, but that decarbonization of that sector will allow us to identify opportunities in other sectors, which I'll come back to. So what do we, how can we accelerate the energy transition would be the next question. First of all, as I said, 50% of emission coming from electricity, that's a fact. The other fact is that Japan or many of countries in ASEAN, they're island countries and also surrounded by political tensions, right? So that's another, islands, it's a fact, right? Political tension, you never, whether you call it a fact or not, but it's a tricky region that we live in. The other one is grids, because unlike US or Europe, grids are not connected across the region. So what does that mean? It means that we need to think how we can decarbonize without grids connected or without pipeline connected. And that means we need to, at least the recipe that's applied in Europe or US cannot be the solution in this region. And I'll come back to, I'm sure Yuki will discuss the GFAN's the coal decommissioning. But I think the solution at least is that it's not just about shutting down coal and renewable, but it's all the portfolio of energy so that we can continue to consider or take into consideration of energy security while thinking about CO2 reduction. So GFANS, I think, is doing a great job, and I'm sure GFANS will be able to come up with a framework in the next, for APAC, APAC managed phase out in the next few months, but I'm sure Yuki-san will explain that. I also want to emphasize, I'm sure our fellow panelists will discuss, which is JET-P, because energy transition is important. ETM is also another important project, because energy transition will allow opportunities or allow us to identify opportunities in other sectors. So if I go back to the original statement I made, so how can we scale up? So JET-P, managed phase out, all very important project. But one thing I think we're missing is that sometimes we're discussing too much about science-based or 1.5 degrees trajectory or lock-in, greenwashing. I'm not arguing that those criticisms are not constructive. I think it's very important to get challenged, but at the same time, we need to think about the scale of capital that's required. Yuki-san, I think you mentioned $500 billion every year. Whether that's $1 trillion, $500 billion, it's at least much more than what the amount of capital that's being mobilized today, right? And there's a Chinese premier from 50 years ago. He said, black cat, white cat, I'm not Chinese, so I don't know, but how he framed it was, black cat, white cat, I don't care, as long as the cat catches a mouse. It's a good mouse. I agree with him in a way that for this climate, battle against climate, it's the same thing. Money, there's no good money or bad money. It's the size of money that matters. And if you think about, Sean, you mentioned about resilience. Same thing when earthquake hit Japan or recently Turkey. When those natural disaster hits, you need money right away, right? Whether it's aligned or not, but you need billions and billions of dollars quickly before, or rather than think, is this the right money or not? And I think it's the same argument applies in the context of climate change or mitigation as well. Let's think how we can mobilize $500 billion every year in the next 10 years or so for the purpose of energy transition, which will unlock decarbonization opportunities in other sectors. Of course, we need to think about greenwashing, lock-in, science-based, all of these factors are important, but we need to balance the argument so that we can we can reach the outcome, which is, again, mobilizing $500 billion or so in the energy transition. So I want to not only talk about the progress we made over the last 2 years, which I think was a good progress, but at the same time, how can we mobilize trillions of dollars to this region, not just in Europe or US or Japan, but ASEAN region. I think that's something we need to discuss further so that, next year or 2 years from now, we will be able to showcase that we've started mobilizing capital as opposed to just discuss framework reports. That will not generate the outcome that we all want. So let me stop there.
I want you to tell us how we're going to raise the capital because you can't let him go. But two things first. The global figure, according to McKinsey, is 9.2 trillion a year. So the energy sector just alone is $500 billion. And on the resilience side, the lesson learned from Turkey was the proper carrying through of standards. We saw the deaths in Turkey being at least 3 to 4 times what they should have been, simply because we hadn't put in proper, let's call them resilience standards. Or in Pakistan last year, where something like 50%, possibly 75% of the deaths were there because the Pakistani government had failed to follow through on adaptation advice that had already been given 10 years before. This is why resilience is important. Building it into our procurement requirements is really critical going forward. So it's CapEx up front that will save a lot of money and deaths later if we get it right. But how do we raise this money again?
Is this on? Good. So a couple of things, and I'm sure Yuki-san will discuss the blended finance or how can we take advantage of public money. But the key question is that the government or all of us need to encourage financial institutions to front-load the investment, right? As opposed to requiring or basically pushing pressure on banks or those financial institutions committing to net zero to say, okay, where are you today? Where are you next year? Where are you going to be 2 years, 3 years from now? Because we know, at least we think our finance emission will go up in the next 2-3 years before going down. Maybe it's not 2-3 years, maybe it's 5, hopefully less than 10 years. But I think it's important for all stakeholders to encourage more mobilization now so that we can reduce transition risk and also physical risk as a result. If you put too much pressure on financial institution, or maybe it's same for public institution, that you should not invest in green or less than green activities, then people will just stop funding to brown sectors, and then no transition will take place. So I think what we ought to do is to define the next 5 years or so as a kind of front-loading period so that you invest more And then from there on, we hope that the emission will actually come down, especially in the region like Asia or ASEAN. That, I think, is maybe this is nuanced thing, but 2 years ago when we committed to net zero, we all perhaps gave an impression that the finance emission will go down from where we are straight down to net zero by 2050. And the more we understand the situation, that is not necessarily the case.
What do you think, Yuki?
Just maybe start on the paper decarbonization, as it's sometimes called, about just divestment. So I think the net zero commitments are all around financed emissions. So as Thomas-san said, the easiest way to radically offload that financed emission is through decarbonization of your highest emitting assets, probably coal power plant being a typical one. And so I take the analogy of a horse and a cart, and the horse is our investment. Where does our finance lead us to? And the cart is the financed emission. So the horse should be leading the financed emission outcomes, but because initially everyone was very much hooked on how to reduce that financed emissions, people were kind of leaving behind the horse and putting the cart before the horse, as it were. Today, I think I agree with Thomas-san that a lot of thinking has started to and a lot more understanding about what paper decarbonization does and the unintended consequence that it has. Because as in the morning panel, I introduced GFANZ as 550 financial institutions around the world, representing about 40% of the financial markets, which means that 60% of the financial market is still outside of the GFANZ community. And they're the ones who will take up that divestment that happens from a GFANZ member. So in the real economy, the asset still lies there and is managed by less stringent standards in most cases. And it could be that it provides more carbon than if it stayed with a GFANZ member. So what we're currently trying to do right now is to think about how do you make a distinction between a managed phase-out and a non-managed phase-out? If you're calculating at today's finance emissions, which is a backward-looking accounting methodology, you cannot really make any difference between a managed phase-out coal and a non-managed phase-out. So that's one of the things that we are discussing within the group. And Thomas-san is actually part of the work stream on the GFANZ APEC workstream on the managed phase-out of coal, where we are looking at all sorts of different things, including the lack of metrics that distinguish between a managed phase-out and a non-managed phase-out. Because right now, you wouldn't know until like 10 years later that it has gone that way. So one of the things that we've been looking at is like the temperature measurement, which is a bit more forward-looking metric about where your portfolio is going to, and that could also be something that could be used in a managed phase-out. But what we have learned in general in terms of climate financing, and it started from TCFD being one of the first risk management systems that are forward-looking. Everything before that used to be very much a backward-looking assessment. So from TCFD onwards, a lot of the climate finance activities that we've been doing at GFANZ, but also at other initiatives like CBI or UNEP-FI, have been to fill the gap of how do you assess something that is going to happen in the future and to be able to change your activities today, your actions today. And we still have a lot to work on around that area.
An announcement, if I may. The Climate Bonds Initiative today at this session is launching our entities certification program for transitions. So this is about a company that has a CapEx plan, which fits with the declining thresholds we have to see, can get a transition certification to help them capital raising, subject to annual reporting and meeting their targets. They need to meet global standards in steel or chemicals or property or transport or whatever, but that is available as of today, information on our website. So this is a key part. These kinds of tools to assess and provide confidence for investors going forward are becoming part of the landscape. One of those people working on tools has been Nazmeera Moola at 91, who, with the work on transition frameworks for investors, working with other investors. Nazmeera, can you tell us what you've been looking at and what it looks like for the purposes of everyone else?
I think Tomo made some really critical points around the fact that the debate has moved on massively over the last couple of years, away from divestment, away from exclusion, partially because it doesn't work, and partially because I think our understanding of how to achieve better solutions has evolved considerably. And one of the other elements that has moved on is that climate solutions are increasingly moving from just being green to also including transition. And CBI has been a big part of that build out of the framework. I mean, one of the areas that we started working on last year with the Sustainable Markets Initiative was this idea of understanding what transition investments at portfolio level would be. So you have asset owners wanting to invest more in this area, you have asset managers claiming to do transition, but often there isn't a common language or understanding of what qualifies as transition. So we've done some work on the categorization of transition, particularly for emerging markets, and we've included both the green and the decarbonization investments in that. And there's ongoing work to refine the metrics and the timelines around that in order to provide integrity to what is included. Because I think as asset owners increasingly focus on setting targets for investing in climate solutions, Yuki's point is really critical, which is that we have to include the decarbonization investment there as well. Otherwise, we're not actually going to achieve the reduction in emissions that we need. And electricity is the starting point. One, because the point's already been made, it's 50% of current emissions in ASEAN, but it's also the solution to many other industries' problems. So solving the electricity issue has a massive bearing for transportation, particularly in your light vehicles and short distances. It has massive implications for industry. And I think what we're seeing from investors is a desire to invest in those companies that are actively developing transition plans, actively, I sort of think about it in three pillars: setting ambitious targets, developing high quality plans where it's clear what they're going to do, and then thirdly, starting to implement. And I think we're all getting to the point where we realize implementation is not going to result in emissions reduction necessarily in years 1, 2, and 3, but we need to understand what we're monitoring in those early years if we're not monitoring emissions reduction. So maybe I'll stop there, Sean.
That's a really critical point, that this is not about linear pathways. And Nazmeera, in a couple of conversations we've been involved in with international investors who've been using a linear emissions reductions pathway, they're suddenly finding they're not supporting those companies who need to transition. And so you're going to get a jagged pathway or sometimes a cliff where it's going to stay high for a while and then drop down, depending on the nature of the company you're investing in. But what do you mean by ambitious? Because you said ambitious a couple of times.
So before I answer the ambitious, I mean, the easiest way to achieve a linear decarbonization pathway is just to, on a programmatic basis, sell high-emitting companies and buy tech and healthcare. Yes. That goes a long way to achieving a linear decarbonization pathway with absolutely zero real-world benefit. What do I mean by ambitious? So what we mean by ambitious is something that, when adjusted for sector and geography, is Paris-aligned. And I think we all understand that making those adjustments is more art than science at this point in time, but I think we need to base it on the best available science that we have. And sometimes it's some median of the various scientific estimates that are there, but that is what we try to do. Is those targets to 2030 in particular need to be aligned with what is possible in the sector given the technology and adjusted for geography.
So remember those words, what is possible given the sector and the technology, but still in line of 1.5. Now this is not easy, right? This is challenging. Lazeena is going to tell us about that in a minute in terms of how it works in Indonesia, because it's tough. It's tough. This is not a transition which is going to mean simple steps for different companies. To achieve what global investors are looking for will require substantial levels of planning, substantial levels of government support. And the other thing we're launching today, by the way, is 101 policy ideas for decision makers to mobilize capital for transition finance. Again, available on our website as of right now. It is a tough thing to do. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from other sectors, but applying them is work. But before I cut to Lazeena, I'd like to bring in you, Hiroshi, from Bank Norinchukin, because you've been a bit of a quiet achiever in terms of the investment in sustainability that you've been pursuing, the conversation you've been having with your clients, your agricultural and forestry and fisheries co-op clients and so on. But you've been committed to this area for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of your appetite for sustainable and transition investments and what you're looking for in opportunities, especially in ASEAN?
Hello, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I wish be there, well in the Kabaya, like Sean's, but you talk about the nature of investment. First of all, as you know, the Norinchukin Bank is the agricultural cooperative, national level institution of agricultural cooperative. But having said that, we have a huge investment in the globally, as well as in Asia. So when we're talking about our nature of the net zero policy, is of course we have to work with the customer, like Tomo-san said, to manage their financial ambitions. But also we are huge investors, so we have to think about global net zero target strategies to do that. And we come back to the Asian market. I think particularly for Japanese bank like Norinchukin, as well as I'm sure that NU appreciate the same thing. But, there is a relevance to the Asian market. We understand that there is a huge potential in the market, and our clients have operations in Asian countries and see huge potential growth in Asia. They try to balance the robust business goals and the decarbonization in their operations. So I guess an Asian bank like us have a role to play. So in that sense, we will happy to work with government or private customers to how to deal with the decarbonization in Asian market. And we joined the Net Zero Alliance this month, so we like to do small transactions with regard to which satisfy the Asian demand for the decarbonization. For that, I stop here.
So, folks, if you want to get Bank Norinchukin's details, let me know afterwards. And I'm sure Tomo could help you as well with the connection. The key point is, this is a incredibly important global investor, one of many, not just joining the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, but looking for deals. We have a problem globally, which is we have the investors. We have more capital available on this planet than ever before in the history of the world. There's no problem finding the $9.2 trillion a year. Our problem is the deals. Our problem is supply. ASEAN can contribute in a huge way to mobilizing those investors. And you give them a choice between a non-green and a green, they take the green. In the second half of last year, we saw global bond markets sort of collapse. We saw a lot of deals pulled at the last minute globally. Bond issuance that didn't happen. Why? Because the numbers were bad, because the investors weren't there. We did not see one green deal that we know of globally pulled. All the green deals still went through. The appetite remained. In March of 2020, when global bond markets froze for 2 weeks, thanks to COVID. We had calls from investors in New York and Paris saying, did you know I'm still getting bids for green? Green bonds stayed liquid. And something you need to know about fixed income investors, they are fundamentally defensive. Larry Fink once said, the head of BlackRock, he did not make money by giving his investors yield. He made money by ensuring his investors never lost their money. A bond which is more liquid, which has bid prices, which also holds its value in downturns, as we've seen in green bonds, is gold dust for a fixed income investor. And that is what's driving demand. It's not sentiment. It's not Yuki's members saying, I want to save the planet and so on. It's because these are actually more valuable in the secondary market. And that drives primary demand. Bear that in mind. This is why demand will stay, is not going to collapse. There's longevity here, which means even if you take 2 years, you're still going to find the investors there waiting for you. It's worth doing the preparatory work. I think so. But talking of preparatory work, whoa, let's look at ETM, Lazeena.
Sure. So thank you for that introduction. Again, for those of you who are possibly less familiar with ETM, ETM is ADB's energy transition mechanism. It is an energy transition program that puts a specific spotlight on the need for early retirement of coal in the ASEAN region. Basically here, when we're talking about opportunity and the need to accelerate our transition pathways, especially in energy, you have over 100 gigawatts of coal with the average age of something like 10 years, 10, 11 years, which means, assuming their, average life of 30, 40 years, that we're almost at 2050 before some of these plants come offline, which is by no means fast enough to achieve the goals that we need to. So as Sean mentioned earlier, we are focused at ADB at trying to sort of apply theory and really focus on demonstrating the potential for early retirement at the asset level. So you've heard a few times that we are working on a precedent transaction here in Indonesia, in West Java, where we're looking at a 660 megawatt coal plant and looking to reduce its life by its PPA contract by 5 to 7 years or so. Again, this is really in the works and under negotiation. And really the challenge that ADB has taken up here is trying to paper all of our ambitions within this transaction. So things we are looking at include how do we document future commitments in a quality manner that could actually set precedents for a lot of other coal assets. How do we use climate finance in a way that's find the Goldilocks zone essentially. How much is too much? How much is too little? What can we do to optimize the early retirement? And then something that we haven't quite touched on yet here is how do we achieve a just transition, right? And so especially in the energy sector, and then you go wider into sort of mining and the rest, this transition, historically we've, as a society, we've gone through many transitions in the past. I think what differentiates this one is the speed at which we have to actually implement it. And that means a lot of fast impacts, relatively speaking, on a lot of livelihoods and a lot of regions. So, that is kind of where ADB is trying to take a leadership role within the ASEAN to try and document how we can, best serve the communities that are affected by this. I think, we're also here to talk about opportunities, right? So first of all, yes, through this pathfinding transaction, we hope to at least sort of address some of the near-term challenges with structuring a deal such as this. But we're also coming across broader opportunities / challenges in really making this a reality for a country like Indonesia. I think earlier we were talking about how to find the technical solution and sort of contextualize ambition within what's possible.
What do you mean by that?
Well, here, so it would be great if we could, sort of early retire a lot of coal and then, sort of replace it with renewables. But, as Tomo-san mentioned earlier, this is not a country similar to the OECD. We do not have connected grids. Every solution is local. Every solution, has to take into account the specific region. And so in a country like Indonesia, which has a fast-growing sort of industrialization off-grid, how do you find the right technical solution that still fits within the broader ambition, and our climate goals?
Okay, that sounds like an unanswered question that Ido's going to have to challenge. Because Ido, you've been working on the just energy transition partnerships and making it work in Indonesia. Tell us what the secret answer is to what Lazeena's question is.
About what, the captive or the? Make it on grid. That's the answer. Okay, so so related to this energy transition, to also react to Tomo-san's provocative openings, keynotes. I think there is a reason why we call this energy transition. That's why, because we need a transition. Otherwise, we should call it energy revolution. Because a revolution can happen in a day. But we know that this we cannot have. We have to have the energy transition, and it is also the Indonesian government is very grateful. With the ETM is actually the older sibling of JETP, so to say. It was born earlier, and it is actually part of the JETP deal. So as you know, we announced jointly the JETP, the partnership during the G20, and and it is a kind of historic, not only in terms of the magnitude, but also how the public and private sectors, join hand to hand, join forces to make sure that Indonesia is a prototype benchmark where we can make, we can help the energy transition journey of Indonesia. Of course, 20 billion will not make it. Even if you want to transition the on-grid, rough estimations, the north of the 100 billion, maybe close to 200 billion. So, but we have to start. The most important thing is we have to start, and this is a good start with ETM. And also, one thing that we experience, because I also, as one of the co-lead negotiators of the JETP deal, so I visited, also talked with our friends in South Africa. And I've also been talking actively now with our friends in Vietnam, our younger sibling in terms of the partnership. And from these discussions, we know that all the challenges are idiosyncratic. There is no single pathway of energy transition. The challenges faced by South Africa are different from the ones that Indonesia is facing. Vietnam also different. So this also, I think, creates a lesson that, especially for the global community, that we can't really say that there is a silver bullet. Hey, this is how to do it, and this is how I did it, and this is how you need to do it. So it won't work. It can't work because each country is different. And also the third thing, I'm talking about the philosophy behind the Indonesia's energy transition first. It's also about that, I think it was rightly mentioned that, this is like the issue now, the climate crisis, I should say, is a common problem. So everyone has to contribute. But again, it is a common but differentiated responsibilities. So this is also the thing that has to be understood at the global level as well. And if many countries, regardless of their economic status, can make the successful transition towards a low-carbon economy, it means that we will contribute to it's basically global public goods. We can address the climate crisis that we are facing. So because it is a global public goods, maybe what we need is actually an innovative ways of thinking, both from the public and private sectors, so that we can, because now we are still doing this like maybe, if it is a global public goods, and if that's on the left-hand side of the equation. But on the right hand of the equation is actually, maybe many of us still treat it like it's a private goods. So maybe we need a global pricing for this, somehow, like find a common ground so that we can work on this together. Now, for Indonesia, we know it is because Vietnam also follows the Indonesia scheme of the ZP, which is around 50% public, 50% private. It's basically like a formula. Now it's A plus B. Now, going forward, what we want, so that it can be, so A is public money, B is private capital. Now, maybe if we can, if we can find innovative, not financing as usual channels and financing structure that is not the usual ones, maybe we can make this A plus BX, so that we have a B which is greater than 1. So that should be our goal. And it is easier. I said it seems very easy, but it's actually very difficult because we have to do some reforms, of course, reasonable ones, because in the end of the day, the end game is the developing countries have to develop. So we have to develop, we have to graduate, we have to get our aspirations to have a robust economic development, while at the same time, we break this path of this, energy-hungry, high emission that was actually the old pathways that our, older siblings now the more advanced economies followed. So we broke that. So that's actually the end game that we all need to.
But at the end of the day, aren't you asking particularly private investors to invest in coal? You're just having a caveat that they're going to close it down earlier because they invest in coal. How do you make that argument work? Are you saying you invest in this, but you'll get some development outcomes? Where's the 1 plus 1?
One of the recipes for economic development is that you have to industrialize. There is no such thing. Everyone who this is development economics 101. Yeah? If you want to develop to become high income country, you have to industrialize. And then you have to do all this economic transformation. Now, for Indonesia case, I can only speak for Indonesia. So we have to industrialize, and we will industrialize. So we want to make this a low carbon industrialization.
And that's critical for resilience of our economies, because if our societies don't get wealthier, they're going to be hit harder.
So, okay, like for industrialization, you need what? You need a really stable, reliable energy sources, right? Now, you look at Indonesia. So now, look at the technology now. What do we have? Put the list. I won't say the names. So many of these potential baseload are actually the legacy energy, right? So that's the reality, right? Many of these variables, many of the potential renewable energy are actually variable, RE. So, but there are some, Indonesia is actually blessed with both, the legacy baseloads and the potential for the baseload for the renewables. Now, so that's why when I said Indonesia has captive issues, those kind of things, so there is actually a way to do it. We have to think to invest of this captive to become non-captive in the future. Going forward, Indonesia, how build the enabling condition for that? What is that? That's the transmission. That's the grid. So because the industrialization will happen, and then you know where the location of the renewables are. So they're so it's not really connected, right? There is a gap there. There is a geographical gap. So what to do? So if we leave this to market, no intervention, what will happen is, the cheapest, the easiest. You build just the legacy, baseload for that. Just in front of your industry, there, it's easy, it's fast, it's cheap. Indonesia has it, and then it's done. But does Indonesia want that? We don't want that, right? We don't want that. So what we do, let's source this from a mix of baseload renewables and variable renewables, and then put them in the on-grid, so that then we also help our renewable energy mix going forward. So you asked for an answer, so that is...
Look, this is an incredibly interesting project, this one. But it's complicated because the just transition aspect to it, and of course, the energy side of it is very difficult. The narrative from a private sector perspective, the narrative to private investors is tough, it's hard, and yet, as you're really suggesting, and as leaders, it's critically important to be able to get through the next 20 years and so on. I think that's right, but is there a challenge of ambition? I mean, you're in the middle of all of this, Lazeena. How do you come up with a deal that works on both sides, which has also got enough ambition to be able to convince independent investors? What's happening in there?
So there's, so again, I'll use a line I've used before, which is there are perceived uncertainties and then there are real uncertainties, right? Perceived uncertainties have to do with, how much governments and different agencies are willing to do to get to your endpoint. And so real uncertainties are, again, how do you structure this? How do you actually get this done? So through precedent transactions, I mean, that is basically the goal, is to try and sort of separate the wheat from the chaff and understand what is really possible, who's committed, how committed are they, how can we actually prototype what we're talking about. I think taking a step back, what you're saying in terms of a middle ground, creating transition assets as a new asset class is a way to avoid this whole just divest of coal, et cetera, because that doesn't work.
Which is crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
to walk away from the problem is not solving the problem. That's
Correct.
Tomo's point, right?
Yeah. So by creating a new asset class here, what we're saying is that there is a middle ground to, to getting there, to heading in the right direction, as Yuki was saying.
Nazmeera, you've been watching closely the South African, and for those of you who don't know, Nazmeera is based in Cape Town, probably dialing in from Cape Town. Tell us how the South African JETP deal is going, especially in the context of your explanation to investors or your continual informing of investors of what's going on. Can you give us a bit of colour on that?
I think the South African JETP deal started being a public sector to public sector interface. And in many ways, the evolution that you've seen as, is busy dealing with Indonesia and Vietnam, where the private sector is being brought in much earlier, is actually more constructive. Because it's about the whole plan around what needs to be financed and then deciding what can be financed publicly and privately. Whereas, as I said, SA started with this public-to-public space. What then happened is in November last year at COP27, the investment plan was released, and now the government is producing an implementation plan. There has already been some flow of funds from some of the European governments around this, and I think the bulk of the private sector money will be used on the grid, this topic that we keep talking about, the grid. The issue is, how do you use some of the public sector money? That point Ito was saying is, so 1 + 1 = 10, not 2. How do you use some of the public sector money to catalyze private sector money into the construction of some of the new generation capacity, but also the grid? Because I think there's a real opportunity to use PPP models with the grid in South Africa and potentially other places in the world as well.
I wanted to come back to a question, Sean, you and Yuki-san, you raised as well, which is around this coal decommissioning, whether it's a JETP, ETM, or managed phase-out. Why would one want to get involved? If you, let's say, if you don't have exposure to, let's say, Indonesia coal now, why would you want to invest in coal decommissioning if you don't have to? But we need to change this narrative, right? And many of us think this. There's a very important work at ISSB and IFRAG, SEC about non-financial disclosure. I think this is misleading. This is not non-financial. This is financial disclosure, part of the financial disclosure, and we need to, I think, completely change the way all stakeholders look at these disclosure. I would call it financial disclosure. Because if you, as I said in answering to Sean, your earlier question, if you focus too much on finance emission, again, why would one want to invest in JETP decommissioning? Because that will increase your finance emission. And I don't know what the return is, but of course it's not, if there's other like green bond investment opportunity, why do you have to? And then that's where you have to change the nature of the asset class so that people want to invest in coal decommissioning, not just because of return, but because you will be rewarded by disclosing that you have exposure to Indonesia JETP or Indonesian ETM. That's where I think the GFAN's managed phase-out project or something we're also working within the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we need to develop a KPI that will complement finance emissions so that people will look at, for example, MEFG's non-financial disclosure, but I would call it financial disclosure, and say, okay, you have finance emission XY, X, and going down to whatever. However, you also have X billion of exposure to Indonesia and JET-P. That's great. That should be the outcome, as opposed to why are you investing in coal? You still have billions of dollars of coal exposure. You have to get rid of this. Then, of course, we can get rid of it, but who would mobilize capital to this coal decommissioning? So I think this is a very good example of how we need to change the narrative so that people, like investors, want to be part of this. And Yuki-san, you have the number, but there are like, what, 4,700 coal power plants in this region. So we will have to come up with 4,700 decommissioning transaction. You're working on first 1 or 2, 3. There's what, 4,700 to go, right? So this is why this has to completely change the way we think about this type of assets, as opposed to just continuing, discussing what's the finance emission, are you going linear reduction or not? That will not get to where we want to be.
So I think one of the things that ADB colleague was saying is you need to demonstrate. I think the other thing that we are trying to do as a collective voluntary initiative is to provide some guidance around what are the criteria of what is the managed phase out anyway, so the definition around it, but also what are the other considerations to have on actually making it a proper deal. So we need to balance that credibility question with the financial viability question. And in there are a lot of different levers that are out there, and the blended finance is definitely one, but carbon credits also, to demonstrate that public good about avoided emissions is a very potential carbon credit as well. And so there's these emerging financial levers that are out there, and then the consideration of just transition as part of the financier's normal due diligence, but it is a new area as well. So those kind of things need to be more articulated, and what we're trying to do at the GFAN's APEC network in our work stream on the managed phase out of coal is just starting that conversation. And on the 8th of June, we will be launching the consultation paper on this. So we will seek your feedback on this, and if you can participate, it would be really great, because there's a lot of things that we are going to be tentatively asking to see, does it work? Does it make sense? Is that credible enough? But then is it financially viable? We don't want to make it too clean that there's no transaction in the live world. But at the same time, if we can't build the credibility in the next 5 years, it will kill the managed phase out. So we want to make sure that we have that our criteria is applicable to a fairly wide pool of 4,700 coal plants in Asia, that we can play with the early decommissioning managed phase out deals, and thereby within the next 5 years we could look at the criteria again and see if we can mainstream it. So I think we're in the nursery stage at the moment, but the nursery has to succeed for us to mainstream after that.
Sure, yeah. No, just related to that, because I think Yuki just brought up sort of timing, right? And I think the question we get a lot beyond this precedent transaction is, okay, we're in a rising interest rate environment, how do you, and it kind of relates back to optimizing the use of concessional finance, this kind of ABC, if you will, of the financing package. The challenge is, as you said, if we don't do this now, we're losing momentum and we lose basically results at the tail end. So I think we're working on that, trying to balance all of these different considerations and making sure we're not overly using the concessional capital, but at the same time taking advantage of that time is of the essence.
I want to turn to the audience in a minute. I've got one more question. So if people have got questions, get ready, because I'm going to ask you to put your hand up and take a few in a row. But first, I want to go to other opportunities. So, Edo, I know you're in the middle of the negotiations and discussions about JETP. May the force be with you, because we need this to work. But I'm also interested in, when it comes to transition, what else in Indonesia's circumstance people need to be thinking about? I mean, there's transport work, is agriculture, is that an area that you're looking at? What are the key areas outside of energy, even though it's the largest area?
Okay, so, well, may the force be with me, so that I won't go to the dark side. Okay, JETP specifically talks about, JETP specifically talks about power. So that's the story. But, power, you have the supply, and you also have the end use, the demand. So in the end of the day, because Indonesia is also, at least in the next 6 to 8 years, we are facing this supply overhang, this oversupply that we may need to absorb before it, it goes away. Now, so some things, there are some the end use, like the EVs, and then what's it called, the hydrogen as well, after with the renewables. So those are the some of the other things that we will look into after. So because now we are working on our comprehensive investment plan. So first thing first. So we have to make a plan for the bread and butter of the JETP. And it's really a privilege. Actually, each institutions of each panelist that I'm sitting here is actually, I have to applaud, because of the commitment, like ADB and ETM for the early retirement of the CFPP. It's really putting the money where the mouth is. And also we've been working very closely with the GFANs. Of course, Mitsubishi UFJ is part of the one of the 7 group, and we have been working very closely for the carbon credit, it's called energy transition carbon financing. So when I met with Mark Carney two times, I think, we really, we mentioned to hold the team, like, this is a new species. Now we are working on the assumption that this thing doesn't exist, this carbon credit, what Yuki-san mentioned. But if this exists, it might actually unlock, the B greater than 1. Might be the case, and then it can accelerate the things that, the ETM friends are doing. So, you can make this synergize. So maybe that's also one of the answers. But for Indonesia's side, I know that there are 2 new developments that have been happening. First is the EV initiative that was announced. We are providing incentives to the motorcycle. So going forward, we are also looking into the public transport and the 4-wheeler, which are currently under our, cooking. We are cooking. And I mean, this might also alleviate, going forward, the fossil fuel needs, so that we won't have to with less dependent on this fossil fuel. Maybe also political issue with every adjustment of fuel subsidy may go away naturally. That's one thing. And second thing, we also just signed, I think it was mentioned by in the previous session here. It was during the leaders retreat in Singapore, the renewable energy MOU with Singapore between Indonesian government and Singapore government, which happened to I also co-lead that negotiation, where actually we can unlock 2 things. First is the unlock the potential of renewable energy supply chain manufacturing in Indonesia, which is good not only for Indonesia but also for the world, so that we can they diversify the supply chain here, and then we can really boost the solar industry in the region. Second, also to showcase that we can link this with the what's called inter-region, in this case between Indonesia and Singapore, green electrons trade. So this kind of thing can happen because we try to synergize different things. So we link the manufacturing, and with the power in this case, and we might get actually maybe a cheaper rating. So this is one of the way, because Singapore is a AAA, right? So this is one of the way on how we have to find innovative ways to it's global public goods, and then this is like, we're still working like this, like private goods. So we have to find way maybe like, out of the box, which I'm sure if we use our brain capacity, each person here, we can come up with many innovative ways where we can find, good cost of capital. Because look, going forward, there are first secular trend is this decarbonization, low carbon. Energy transition is a secular trend. But second, also, we are facing at least short to medium term challenge. Cost of capital is going up because of the recession, interest rates are going up. So I don't know whether to be honest, I don't envy my ADB colleagues here, doing this, because normally we should do this transition easy, early decommissioning with the interest rate differentials. But now, okay, whether the interest rate is higher maybe now compared to when it was, I don't know. But I mean, this kind of thing, so there is these challenges that we need to address. I don't envy my colleagues in the ETM, to be honest, yeah. But I know the ETM is in good hands. And the success of JETP also depends on the success of ETM, of course.
Interest rate differentials, as money is heading towards the US at the moment, are very hard to deal with, of course. Although one of the things we're seeing in the green market is where there's differential price, the wider the spreads, the wider you see the green benefit. So that's one thing to be thinking about. Of course, what we need to do also is bridge different markets. I want to ask questions, but before I go to questions, and Hiroshi and Nazmeera, I have to apologize because I can't see your faces. I'm now moving so I can see your faces. If you want a question. Hiroshi, just a quick question to you before I go to the audience.
Yes.
Currency appetite. Is your appetite for debt outside of Japan just in hard currency, or the instructions you're giving to fund managers? Or do you have appetite for currencies like rupiah as well, if they're sovereign rated or high rated? To give us everyone a flavor. How does it work?
It's a kind of difficult question that I guess currently we prefer the hard currency rather than the local currency, just because of the real fundings or some kind of regulations that force us to do the hard currencies. But I just like pick some of the comment on that previous discussion that when we're doing the sustainability, we're always thinking about the impact on the transactions. We normally thinking about the risk and returns, but having do sustainability kind of activity like sustainability, doing sustainability finance, we realize that we have to think about the impact. If like a transaction like decarbonization or coal plant transitions, we need to articulate or quantify the impact that we take the positions on these kind of transactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroshi. Some questions. I'm looking for 3 questions from the audience.
This is Dr. Atul Aire from India, and representing Midcon Consultancy. I'm working as a vice president of the and business head. The reality in India right now, because we have a G20 presidency and we are doing a lot of work. And in the morning also, Amitabh Kanti explained everything about the India, what in the climate change and the sustainability is doing. But the reality is something different. Being a vice president of the company, I used to go to the many industries and talk to my shop floor people and some people of the, let us say, the technical background. Currently, what happens in India is a top 1,000 NSA, that stock exchange company, limited companies, has been given a mandatory submission of the, let us say, your SBTi commitments or maybe the net zero reduction and those kind of a thing. And then obviously those top corporates are, maybe you can see the Tata and Birla and Dani. So those are I think that the top 10 billionaires of the, let us say, the world, 7 are Indian. So probably the question is like that. The reality is like that 1,000 NSE listed companies been given the targets, but those are falling into the scope 1 and the scope 2 emissions category. But what about the supply chain and the value chain partner, which comes under the scope 3 emissions? When we approach those particular scope 3 emissions organizations, these people rather ask us, if let us say they wanted to do carbon footprint or the life cycle assessment of the product, then probably they may ask, or they ask also, This particular kind of assessment should be done by the Scope 1 and Scope 2 organizations on behalf of Scope 3. And this is where Scope 3 emission organizations not able to pay also. Even if at $20,000 is a consultancy fee for the carbon footprint of the life cycle assessment, they do not want to, let us say, invest also. So this is where the problem is in India, and maybe the 70% small scale sector, which is operating now, and the 70% is nothing but the one problem area where if, let us say, net zero emissions by 2030 or 2050 or 2070 has to be achieved, this 70% small sector or the medium sector company has to be taken into consideration. What the discussion is going on is for the top corporates, the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Thank you.
Good question. I want to take a couple more before we go.
Thanks so much. I think it's there's ongoing discussion on MDB reform. Just what your advice in terms of MDB reform, where the public money, how the reform process can unlock private finance.
Lazeena, do you want to tackle that question about
MDB
the World
reform.
Bank one? And then we're going to talk about supply chain.
Sure. Again, so ADB this year is, and I'll speak for ADB because the evolution roadmap with the World Bank is a whole other narrative. But with ADB, I think there's a lot going on in this last year in implementing a new operating model. And the basic purpose of that is to go back to providing sort of holistic technical solutions for our clients. So basically from the energy sector side, what's being done is we're creating a regional energy sector team. So we can really bring in, solutions, things we're doing in Indonesia, we can sort of pass on to Vietnam and the Philippines and really jumpstart that dialogue along with our government clients. That's really something that is happening on the ADB front. The other thing we're doing naturally is ETM, right? And that is an example of a kind of program where we're putting our money where our mouth is and really trying to put our own capital at risk to try and demonstrate your first generation of transition projects in energy as well as water and agriculture and the rest. So that's how it's sort of implementing and being seen within ADB and with our respective other multilaterals. I think everyone's taking it on their own.
I'm going to go full in. And I'm going to say it's clear that development banks need to become leverage institutions. They are not largely. Noting, by the way, that there are 600 development banks in the world, a lot of national and regional ones as well. There are only about 6 that do any kind of levels of leverage. ADB is sort of getting there. EBRD is way in front of the rest. There is scope to use public sector balance sheets to take bits of risk that will then free up private capital participation in a way that is unheard of in scale so far. And that's what public sector institutions have got to rethink. Enough direct lending, more targeted risk lending to free up other capital flows, and then the bank Norinchukin's coming behind. Sometimes it might be dealing with currency exchange. We have one global facility supported by governments called TCX, only one. It's quite expensive. We need to do more currency support. We need to ensure there are guarantees by development banks for local currency issuance that local currency investors can invest in. In places like Zambia, for example, there are public sector funds that will take local AAA. They won't take anything else. There's no local AAA solar. With a bit of credit enhancement, they will find it large pools of capital ready to deploy. If we did this across 600 development finance institutions around the world, we could make a vast difference to the amount of money that's needed. And then we should rethink the nature of how we use that leverage as well. Look at the capital ratio paper from the G20 about how we can better use the balance sheets of development banks. The usage of guarantees. In development banks, we treat guarantees on the balance sheet at full liability value. In the insurance world, we don't. In the banking world, we don't. We have a fractional value approach. If we changed our accounting models for the usage of guarantees to match what we're using in the insurance sector, we could do 10 times as many guarantees for the same public sector balance sheet. Whoa, there's a big agenda here, Lazeena, eh?
No, of course. And to be honest, I'm not going to be the one to speak about IFCAP and what ADB is doing with that regard, so I won't go into that. But with respect to ETM, what I was remiss to sort of describe is this is only the beginning, right? Because there hasn't been a demonstration of how this is done.
It's a great project.
Yeah, we're starting it, we're doing it. It's still in the middle, it's not done yet. But once it's done, the actual purpose is to roll it up into an ETM fund vehicle, basically, and attract commercial capital, attract sort of different pools of investors, and really try and use what we have put, money up front, but then really attract and, basically leverage the interest and all the investment out there.
But the Scope 3 supply chain question, I'm going to put aside the Scope 3 carbon accounting because I think there's a faster way to do this, which is what we're doing in taxonomies, shopping lists for the future, to make sure that small business are included. However, the point about small business is an incredibly important point. So, Tomo, maybe I'll ask you to kick us off. From MUFJ's point of view, how does this idea translate into lending for all those small businesses in Japan and all the other markets you work in?
Sure. So let me first of all discuss what we, within Net Zero Banking Alliance, we actually have started discussion of how we can cover small and mid-sized firms, SMEs. So as I'm sure you all know, the big companies, the blue chip companies or listed companies will have to disclose their transition plans, whether it's the ISSB, SEC, et cetera, and many of them have already committed to net zero. So of course, those transition plans may not be perfect from the beginning, but I'm sure they will get market pressures and they will revise, and then become more credible over the next few years. However, SMEs, because most of them are non-listed and not getting, how should I say, pressure from equity holders or bond holders that they have to commit to net zero and also accelerate their journey. So how do you do that? We actually, within Net Zero Banking Alliance, we formed a working group to consider how transition plan framework, whether it's GFANs or, as you know, UK came up with a TPT, Transition Plan Task Force. I think the framework is great, but you don't want to go to SME and say, here's 200 pages guideline, here you go, and just come up with your transition plan. I don't think that will work. So we, within the Zero Banking Alliance, we've started thinking, how can we apply proportionality, whether it's a GFANs, TPT, transition plan framework, and apply them to SMEs. However, there's also a challenge of comparability. If you just say, oh, just take, chapter 2, 3, and 5 of the GFANs framework and come up with whatever transition plan you can, we may be able to get whatever the transition plan they prepare, but they will not be comparable, right? So how do you make it proportionate, flexible, but still comparable? To be honest with you, I don't have an answer, but we've actually started thinking to bring best practice from all the Net Zero Banking Alliance members so that at least we can learn from each other. The good news is that the SMEs, the smaller companies, are also getting pressure from through supply chain, whether it's Amazon, Microsoft, same thing for Toyota. These big companies are asking their suppliers to come up with more ambitious plan. So we're not just talking about large corporates. I think it would be important for banks, maybe investors, whether it's Norinchukin or others, to put respectfully, but challenge and put pressure on the big company so that they can also talk to their suppliers, supply chain, so that they will also come up with a bit more ambitious plans. So it's not direct way to make the SMEs to come up with more robust plans, but rather indirect pressures, indirect engagement will basically invite all of these SMEs to be part of this huge undertaking. I think that would be the answer. However, I know we don't have a lot of time. So we are starting from big companies, but I'm sure in the next few years, SMEs will also be part of this big undertaking.
We're going to have to move to wrap up. I've got one person who wants to ask a quick question. 30 seconds, please.
Thanks for that. In fact, it's a question I asked a technical panel on that side. I'm Chintan from Arup, so very much from a built environment background. We all are talking about net zero, and Tomohiro, what you said sounds like it'll take a lot of time. And Ido, you said something around it's not a revolution, it's a transition. But net zero is 2050, 2060. in 7 years we are peaking. What is it that you're doing in 7 years so that 1st of January 2031 we are producing less carbon than December 31st?
I'm going to ask you to take that up in final comments. Hiroshi, can I ask you to give us a farewell reflection to kick us off, please?
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult question to answer. But I say that we saw the opportunity in the Asian market and as well the transition. And as I said, that if we're talking about the sustainability, we have to think about the impact. And once we quantify the impact, there will be a better measurement for us to pursue. So that's, so anyway, we would like to communicate with fundraisers or government or development bank to better serve the need for the Asian countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroshi. Thank you so much for your commitment to this sector. Yuki, a parting reflection, and we'll go around the table.
Yeah. So when net zero commitments are made, they're made for like 2050 at GFANZ, but they are also committing to put 2030 targets as well, so interim targets. And most of them are like reductions by 40 to 50% of baselines around 2018 or 2019. But to get there, I think it's very ambitious right now because of all the things that are happening globally. And one of the things that GFANZ wanted to do was to send that signal back to the policymakers so that there are these enabling environments that enable the private sector to do that. And MDB reform is also another like important condition that will really leverage private finance in this area. So I guess my parting question is that we can't, no one single person has the solution, but that we do have to collaborate together.
Thank you.
I think it's been very comforting, actually, to hear grids come up quite a lot in our discussion and this notion of connectivity, because fundamentally, speaking from the context of Indonesia, where a lot of our work is kind of more advanced, it is challenging to actually, reduce emissions before 2030. But in order for 2030 to be a peak, we really need to spend this time to reinforce the grid, which would basically allow for renewable energy to really take shape and accelerate post-2030. And I think that's a lot of the work that ADB will also be supporting in that time.
Just short ones. First one is energy transition. Transition finance is key. So this one, so that everything can be unlocked. Second, on that question, to make sure that peak is 2030, check out the Comprehensive Investment of Indonesia will be launched in August. And third, I will download your 101 ways to do renewables. I will check your website, and if it doesn't work, then I will blame you. So.
Yeah, what we've learned through this 2 years or so of journey is that number one, the real economy is very dynamic. You engage, you learn, you influence each other. So it's not like you look at your balance sheet and say, okay, how do we reduce finance emission from here on, and how you peak it in 2030? It's actually the more you invest now and encourage your client to do CapEx, that's how you can actually innovate and reduce the emission. So we're not just looking at the current balance sheet. We, as I said earlier, we need to front load the investment. So you may see our finance emission going up, but finance emission does not mean the actual emission. The actual emission may go down or will go down. So there will be a time gap between the finance emission going up or down, but the actual emission will be going down. So we believe that is the case, and our clients really are committing to net zero, and we want to encourage. We want them to come up with more credible plans, and we want to finance. So I've been saying no transition plans without transition finance, but vice versa, non-transition finance without transition plans. So, these two go hand in hand. I'm sure we will be able to showcase progress, next year when we're back here or 2 years from now. we believe that the transition our finance will enable actual emission reduction in the real world. Thank you.
So the critical issue is credible transition plans in the context of our 1.5 degree Celsius targets. But that's complicated once you get into the detail necessarily. Of course, Ito's going to make it very simple by the time he's finished to explain it to the world, which is where we've got to get to, because our investors around the world need to be able to tell their clients, their beneficiaries, how this works and why this is important. But the challenge is big. The capital, however, is there if we give the right offer. It's not a shortage of capital. We don't have a limited pie here. We have a very large slab of capital. We just need to manufacture the opportunities. The truth is, we have opportunities not just in energy, and of course in grids. That's the big opportunity in Asia, to invest in grids, large capex, critical. We have to quadruple electrification by 2050. That's going to be a lot of grid work. But it's also in industrial. It's also in critical minerals for the transition. There's a new commodities boom going if we get it right. It's also in the right kind of agriculture that's consistent with resilience and with emissions management and so on. And of course, urban development, which is not just about creating livable cities, although that's the core of what we're doing. It's also about getting emissions down fast. That is the fastest way to manage emissions, improving energy efficiency, which will cut energy bills while we're at it too. What's not to like with planning up front? Arup is one of the global leaders in this. Thanks for asking the question. Our newest certified verifier globally. There is a lot to be done. The opportunities are immense if we get it done. But remember that the risks of not doing it in time are immense as well. We must act. The message I would send to you is, don't walk, but run. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks for this fantastic panel.